Right?
Yeah.
How do you produce a beer in Adam Mickiewicz. Mickiewicz.
How are your friends?
Yeah. Vowel stop.
Like, kind of like floppy hair.
You could just say
From like a
and distress. And ultimately.
Yeah, all is it. But
Oh, but Cynthia, we won't be there on Friday.
I should have asked her
just
what
gonna
that's all
just
about.
say your name.
We're starting already.
Check your angle.
It's fine.
I knocked one of the legs.
Oh, it's like the opposite of
Precision.
that's it. Exact words.
Welcome, everyone, to our very late first talk of the term, weather related. So June sent you around the schedule, and so we've made an adjustment. So I've forgotten what can you remind me what we did?
So we moved Michael's presentation to February 27th. So we traded places with him. So our presentation, mine and Laura's, will be on March 13th instead.
And if I remember correctly, there still is a slot or two free for AAAL dry runs. So rather than take the time today, I would urge you to contact June or myself because they will fill up. Normally it ends up in the little mini AAAL before we go because there are a lot of people who are going to be presenting. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to Vauci to introduce and welcome our guest speaker.
Right, it was a great pleasure that we welcome Jeff to this to our first research group meeting. I'm just gonna read some pieces of information about you, and then anyway, just before he has a PhD in Slavic linguistics from the University of Washington in Seattle from 2000. He's a professor at the University of Adam Mickiewicz. In the Department of Contemporary English Language, and his research is on phonetics, phonology interface, speech perception, historical phonology, second language acquisition, and obviously Slavic linguistics. He also has some connection with Canada. He did his BA at the U of T in Toronto, so
Long time ago.
But he's now in Poznan in Poland. He's a professor at that university that I won't try to repeat. And he's known also I'm saying this. He's also known for the cool titles of his presentations and papers, including Which Phonetics is Phonological? And my favorite, Who Needs a Nucleus? So I'll pass the baton to you, and thank you very much for being here.
Before you start, Jeff, has anyone said anything about the camera and why it's here?
Yes, we talked about it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So CBC, this is live streaming.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks for the very flattering introduction. And so, well, the title, we're interested in L2 pronunciation, of course. Particularly in Poland, there's a big it's highly emphasized in the English instruction in Poland. Pronunciation is emphasized quite a bit, and actually in our department, students can choose British or American accents. And sometimes I switch to British for fun. I'm working on it anyway. So L2 pronunciation is a big thing for us, and actually gives me fond memories of the last time I was in Montreal for New Sounds back in 2013. So it's good to be back here. And this is a relatively, well, I would like to say this project is almost finished. We call it Vowel Dynamics for Polish Learners of English. And so this project is what I'm reporting on. A number of collaborators, all from Faculty of English at UAM, and you can pronounce some of these if you like. And so that's what we're looking at today. So to make, I guess, before I get into specifics, we talk about vowel dynamics and vowel inherent spectral change, and how much of that detail we're going to get into remains to be seen. I suppose it depends a little bit on the questions, because it's a very complicated phenomenon in terms of acoustic measurements and how we describe it and how we quantify it. So that's one thing. But I guess we start more with just why, It's like, why do we worry about the phonetic details of these things, yeah? Generally, to an outline for the talk then, we'll have just a few questions I'll raise to get us started, talk a little bit about some of the current models and theories of L2 speech, and the notion of what is similar between an L1 and L2 is kind of a problematic phenomenon that I'm hoping that our project actually says something about, and we need to maybe refine that view of what it is in one language as opposed to another language. So, of course, why do we study L2 phonological acquisition? To train our teachers, to train our students, to eliminate foreign accents, and to speak more better English or whatever other language we're learning. I'll be a little provocative here. Maybe I don't want to be too snide, but we've been doing this for quite a while now, so how is it that foreign accents still persist, right? Assuming we know the L1 phonology and the L2 phonology, shouldn't that actually be enough to guide us when we're instructing? And so my take on that question is perhaps we have to go and look at the phonologies of these languages again and maybe reconsider the way we look at what it is that might be similar between one language and another with regard to the phonological systems. And so this project is looking at kind of a low-level phonetic detail, according to what traditional people would say, as sort of and how it's related to L2 acquisition. So before I get into that, I guess I'll go briefly. This is just one slide on models of L2 speech, really. I mean, I presume that folks around here are pretty similar with these models, so I'm just going to give it one slide. But basically, they're all crucially based on comparing the phonology of L1 and the phonology of L2. So if learners are going to have difficulties, we're going to be able to predict those difficulties based on their L1 and based on the L2. And of course, when we compare phonologies, then we sort of ask, okay, what do they have in common? What do they not have in common? What's similar? What's different? And this and that. And those types of questions have driven a lot of the research into L2 speech acquisition. Two of the more frequently cited models are Flege's speech learning model. And actually, one interesting thing about Flege's speech learning model is it suggests that when there's something new and different, it's actually easier to acquire because the learners can hear that it's new and they get it. When something's too close to what they have in their L1, they don't get it. That's part of one of the major aspects of the SLM, which is, when we organize new sounds, it's a perfect name for that conference, and it comes right from that model, kind of. What's new? The other one to mention here, I suppose, is the perceptual assimilation model. This is a little more based on contrasts and distinguishing contrasts. So, for example, Germans, according to this model, Germans who have a similar contrast to sheep and ship, they shouldn't have too much trouble with sheep and ship and getting them confused, whereas Spanish speakers should. Yeah. Interestingly, Polish could claim to have a very similar contrast, but Polish speakers have trouble, even though they seem to have a similar contrast. So anyway, the question I would raise is, what is it that we really compare across languages? Yeah, how do we define what's similar and what's not similar? And of course, traditionally, the easiest way to do this is to look at our phonetic symbols, see what they say. So we look at the transcription of one and the other, and that helps us to define what's similar, what's different. It helps us to make predictions according to these models and theories. Okay, so if we move specifically to vowels sort of traditionally we would say, okay, we compare vowels on the basis of two-dimensional charts with a height dimension and a front-back dimension. Occasionally we might enhance things with like a length diacritic or like a double symbol for a diphthong or something like that. But for the most part, we have this two-dimensional chart. And so, okay, so this is a basis for making predictions about what's similar and what's not similar. The chart you see here actually shows British English and Polish. The Polish vowels are in parentheses. 1, 2, 3, no, wait, 5 of them, 6 of them. The Polish, and so then, okay, we can look at this chart and say, these are pretty similar, these are pretty similar. These are a little bit more far apart. This is kind of halfway between this, and we could make some predictions. Okay, oh, well, English has 2 vowels up here, Polish only has 1. So we can make some predictions about things like this.
Could I ask you if you yourself become a fluent speaker of Polish?
Yeah, I did study Slavic. My Polish is yeah.
And your vowels.
No one's. I mean, sometimes they hear me as a foreigner. Sometimes they don't. I don't know if it's the vowels so much as what I do to their sibilants. So Polish has,
of which they have far too many.
Yeah, but they have these very subtle acoustic contrasts between like a sh and this. And I don't always bother with that.
Okay, sorry.
That's interesting. Yeah. So someday I will do some detailed acoustic analysis of my Polish, but not today. Anyway, so then the question I'm asking is, how useful is this chart, right? Because one thing about this chart is that time is not represented, is it? Yeah. So like a vowel lasts a certain duration of time, and it's hard to really show this on a two-dimensional chart. Okay, so what does this tell us about the vowel systems? On the basis of what phonetic features do we define the perceptual identity of vowel quality? And I would talk about vowel inherent spectral change, which we'll refer to just as VISC. So vowel inherent spectral change, just most simply we could call it diphthongization, right? Sort of shifting around in the vowel. The vowels move around on this chart. And we'll show you some nice pictures of vowels moving around on the chart short enough. So what the suggestion then is that we can better understand whether the vowels in L1 and L2 are similar or different on the basis of how much movement there is in the vowel quality over the course of its duration. So we'll talk a little bit about VISC, changes in vowel quality over the course of duration, usually sort of described in terms of acoustic space. So we take our two-dimensional chart and we draw arrows and movement and things like that. Diphthongization, if you will. Of course, diphthongization of monophthongs rather than just diphthongs. Yeah. And that's a kind of a complicated phonological question to define. Okay, so how do you know when a diphthong is really a diphthong? Yeah, it's not one. It's not one I'm answering here. We're paying more attention to just the vowels of English that are traditionally transcribed as monophthongs. Yeah. Of course, if you take E in British English, it's like A. Yeah, beach. Go to the beach. Yeah. Of course, anyway. So you see that, and of course the trap vowel in American. Yeah. Very diphthongal as well. Okay, so the English vowels move around a lot, as we know. What about other languages? Here's a little illustration. So we have one of our highly proficient, very high C2 level Polish speakers of English producing sort of these are pairs of vowels that are relatively similar in terms of where they are in the two-dimensional charts, yeah? And so so what you're seeing there is, like, we've chopped off the the consonants, the 20% after the onset consonant and the 20% before the coda consonant, and we have fleece and kit and dress and trap versus Polish I, and a. Yeah, and you could see that there's a great deal more movement here in the English versions of the vowels than in the Polish versions of the vowels. Yeah. So Polish vowels really are very, very, very pure in their quality. Yeah. So we'll take a few instances at some point. They're very pure in their quality, and sort of English vowels, particularly Southern British English, which is the pronunciation model for most of our students, are very shifty vowels. North American English are a little bit less shifty than Southern British English, I would think. Yeah. Okay. So moving on. So one thing that we're investigating actually is, well, where does this visc come from? Where does this movement come from? One of the possibilities for an explanation is why English vowels are so shifty has to do with the neighboring consonants. Yeah, okay, so that previous slide, we sort of tried to get rid of the consonants. We only showed the middle of the vowel. But in a sense, well, what do we know about sort of the consonant-vowel interaction in phonetics, right? So vowels, when you sort of produce a consonant and then a vowel, you make kind of a transition from one to the other. Yeah? And that transition from one to the other actually kind of takes place on what acoustically is a vowel. Yeah? So we have the initial, say, 20 to 30% of a vowel. Listeners hear that, and they use the acoustic information in that initial 20, 30% of the vowel to identify the consonant that they're hearing. Yeah? It's like the movement, because when it comes down to it, if you release the release burst of a p or a d or a k, it's not very robust acoustically. It's hard to hear what consonant, especially if a bus goes by, you're going to be completely, yeah. So we need the acoustic information on the vowel, which is much more robust, and it helps us to identify it. So what happens when we slow these transitions down? Yeah. So that whole CV transition gets slowed down, and so the formant movement associated with it, that's sort of induced by the consonants, sort of lasts longer. Maybe it occupies 40, 50, even 60% of the vowel. Yeah. And then, sort of in kind of an evolutionary sense, listeners of the language start to sort of reinterpret that movement, saying, this is kind of a diphthong type thing. Yeah? So they reinterpret the movement as an inherent feature of the vowel. So the shifty quality of English vowels, I would say, is in large part a function of this consonant-vowel interaction. Yeah? And of course, the coronal consonants are the most common. You might sort of generalize one particular consonantal context. Yeah, so like t, d, n, s, and those all produce similar effects. So those effects would probably take more precedence than what you might find for b or g or something like that. So just one of my favorite ways to illustrate this is the word soon in English. So if you hear my production of soon, the first half of that vowel is quite fronted. Sort of in the second half of the vowel, you can look and see that, okay, it's moving towards the back of the target, right? So the U has a back target, but it takes me a long time to get there when I say soon. Now, if I put on my best Polish accent and say soon, it sounds like this, soon. And so the back vowel, the backness of the vowel is almost instantaneous, yeah? So you could see a transition, but it's much more rapid. Yeah, and there are other differences too, but that's the effect that we're driving at. So this is really, in some cases, an effect of consonant-vowel interaction. Okay, and so here's some acoustic illustrations. Just we have, okay, this is a d plus an r, a d plus an a in Polish. then there's not so much movement here. And here the movement sort of lasts a much greater amount of the vowel. Okay. And so some of the interactions then between consonants and vowels appear to be a function of this. So again, we have, of course, VISC then is language specific. So we get these effects in English, but not so much in Polish because our transitions are much more rapid. And so this is, do I have this? Does this work? Oh, wait. This is one of our two. I forgot I had sound. Oh. Yeah, maybe we can do it without amplification. No, maybe we need amplification. Anyway, I'll just imitate them for now. For the next one, I don't know, we have time. But so you get, what you see here, this is the F2 sort of more or less corresponding with the front-back dimension on the chart, and you see a lot of movement here, and you see kind of a flat sort of thing now. So deed. This is a British pronunciation model. So again, why do we have VISC in the English vowel system? Well, if you just look at some of these charts, right, and so you have different colors represent different vowels in the system. Look at all the overlap in the system. How are listeners going to keep their vowels straight if they're all like in one blob? Yeah. And this one of the things that we find is that VISC seems to be kind of connected with larger vowel systems, and then the two-dimensional space gets more crowded. Yeah. And so the trajectories and the movement of the vowel quality tends to take over. Of course, in small vowel systems, that motivation, the perceptual motivation to keep the vowels distinct is less dramatic. There's a little more space for each vowel to sort of occupy. And you might expect more pure vowels. It's not quite the case. There are some complications. It's not quite the case that all languages with small vowel systems have pure vowels. There are plenty of diphthongal languages, like language with a small vowel system that are diphthongal. But there is kind of this extra motivation when you have, there's less motivation for VISC and maybe other factors that contribute to it in some languages with small vowel systems. Anyway, one of the things that when we talk about pure vowels, well, one of the implications of that is that, well, your CV transition has to be very rapid to get to your target early in the vowel. In order to be pure, it has to sort of start early and sort of continue. So there should be less movement in the system. Anyway, there isn't much out there on the L2 speech literature on VISC. There's maybe one or two papers I might be able to add to this, but there's not much out there. So I like to think this is cool, cutting-edge stuff. We'll see. Okay, so basically our hypotheses that we've been investigating in the project have to do with both cross-linguistic studies and cross-sectional studies, and there are a couple of other studies that are still in progress, haven't quite finished yet. So if we compare L1 and L2 production, we should be able to document differences in the amount of formant movement or changes in vowel quality in L1. If we look at a cross-section of different levels of English proficiency, we should be able to find more formant movement in the more proficient speakers. With regard to perception, in L1 Polish, we shouldn't expect listeners to rely on formant movement. They should be quite accurate at identifying the vowels without it. And then in sort of cross-sectionally, we should expect more proficient learners to be able to recognize the movements. Yeah. So so some of the stuff that we've done so far, again, a cross-sectional production experiment, comparing some of my colleagues with our first-year students, very convenient subjects to have in the experiment. And so in VISC production as well as in VISC perception in L2. Yeah, so we compare L2. We also do cross-language studies with, if you have highly proficient speakers whose pronunciation is good, it's nice to hear both their L1 and their L2, and you can also compare their L1 with sort of monolinguals L1. You can do all sorts of stuff with. Once you have like the same group of speakers doing two different tasks, that's a useful thing. We also have the perception studies in sort of L1, L2, sort of cross-language perception study and a cross-sectional perception study. We're also doing a phonetic code switching study where we're looking at L1 and we're making in an L2 context. So like the speakers would have to produce L1 words, but in an L2 carrier sentence. And so
It'd be interesting to have data from fluently bilingual from births, like English, Polish speakers. You don't have to have any of those.
I know one 11-year-old who would fit that yeah, speaker one.
Yeah, that would be cool. I mean,
Yeah. He'd figure it out though. He wouldn't be a very good. He'd figure out all the stuff I'm kind of. Yeah, I have to like.
these ones.
Yeah, something. I don't know. So that's one aspect. We're also looking at we also have a longitudinal study over the year because our students get very intensive pronunciation training in the first year. They get like 3 hours a week of pronunciation, and so we're comparing the beginning of the year, the middle of the year, the end of the year, but we don't have too many results there. With the code switching study, surprisingly, it looks like there's not much there actually in the code switching study. So it's like when they switched back to their L1, they actually produced pretty accurate L1s. I don't have all the details about that. So how are we doing this? And I'll probably save a lot of this for discussion because from what I understand, your typical MO here is 20-30 minutes of initial presentation and then discussion. So that's what we'll leave it to. So really acoustic comparisons of L2 vowels and similar vowels in L1 and L2. Again, British pronunciation model. Basically, we're using citation form productions of CVC words. We generally have been controlling for the final consonant and including the initial consonant, coronal, labial, or dorsal, as a factor for analysis. The perception studies have been forced choice identification tasks where we compare a number of different stimulus conditions. So basically, what we're doing is we're making listeners listen to different portions of the vowel. So either they hear the beginning of the vowel, the middle of the vowel, the end of the vowel, or some combination, both the beginning and the middle, the end, but not the middle. So, and then seeing how which portion of the vowel that they hear affects what their identification accuracy is. So, assuming you have pure vowels, it shouldn't matter which part of the vowel they hear. They should hear, their accuracy should be constant across those different stimulus conditions. Whereas when you have a lot of movement, listeners tend to need to hear the beginning and the end very often. And actually, there are a lot of L1 studies on this. It's called the silent center paradigm, where, in fact, in a few of the studies, most of them are from North America, actually, a few of the studies, this silent center condition where they hear the beginning and hear the end of the vowel, but not the middle, which is, of course, supposedly supposed to contain the target, right? The nucleus of the syllable, the middle of the vowel. Who needs a nucleus? So you get the beginning and the end, and actually listeners are much more accurate on those than they are when they hear the vowel midpoint. And in one experiment, I think they were even equally accurate with those as with the ones where the vowel wasn't altered at all. Yeah. So that's for the basic strategy for the perception studies. And I'll go into more details about the experiments if people are interested in the discussion, because there's all sorts of details like how do we measure this, how do we do this and that, and that'll come out. But I'll give a little bit, just an overview of some of our results, because this is sort of an overview of the entire project. Generally, the most of our useful production results just come from those four that I showed you on the slide there, the fleece, kit, dress, and trap. Those are the best. Those represent the best L1 L2 comparison as something like that could be similar. That's one thing. So generally, they support the hypothesis. So the more proficient speakers do show more movement. And when we had a cross-language study with the same speakers in their L2, they produce more movement than they do in their L1. With production also, we find that most of these effects happen in the height dimension, the first formant, rather than the second formant. That's an interesting thing that I guess I'm not gonna comment on that more now. But it might have to do with some sort of articulatory setting thing. And this is sort of goes back to the question about my Polish, right? So I have this impression when I try to put on my best Polish pronunciation that I like tighten everything, yeah, and increase the tension of my articulators, and that in principle should cause more rapid movements, so faster CV transitions, and I get to my vowel target sooner.
That must be measurable, surely.
Oh yeah. Well, it's tricky though because there are all sorts of factors. So yeah. Well, I mean, we don't have the articulatory equipment to do that. You need Emma, I guess, to do that. And with the other effect that we find in production has to do with the effects of onset consonants, the coronal, the differences between groups or the differences between L1 and L2 seem to be more robust in coronal when the onset consonant is coronal rather than labial or dorsal. And that's kind of an interesting sort of finding actually, because in principle our coronal articulatory gestures are more rapid than labial dorsal gestures. There's articulatory phonology has kind of established this, and in this case, well, the English speakers really slow down those, it takes them a long time to get from a coronal consonant to a back vowel, or to get from a coronal consonant to a low vowel, so this is kind of an interesting finding too. All right, with perception, generally things, well, actually, there's one study that don't quite, the more proficient speakers rely more on VISC for L2 vowel identification. So, like, these silent center tokens are the most accurately identified of the tokens we looked at. And this actually, for our very advanced group and for our beginners as well, they aren't really beginners because they're already university students. And hearing just the beginning or just the center of the vowel tended to fool listeners, yeah? So it's like they didn't quite hear all the movement they were supposed to hear, and that caused problems. And in the cross-language study, L1 Polish vowel identification didn't show any effects of the type of stimulus condition they heard. Okay. So what does this all mean? Well, generally, we would say there's more to L2 vowel acquisition than is shown in our two-dimensional vowel charts. And also that the results suggest that the idea that the consonant-vowel interaction is driving this, or somehow is important, is something we have to explain. Yeah. And so, what does all this mean for phonological similarity across languages? Okay, so one of the, shall we say, one of my little pet aspects of all this is something, well, my heart really is in phonology more than L2 acquisition, and in phonology I really don't like the segment. Somehow these symbols that we use, they're useful for a language like English because they are, but I don't necessarily see these symbols as a useful way. This can be very misleading at times. And of course, descriptions of similarity in much of the literature are based upon segments. It's understandable given the circumstances, right? But but at some sense we need to maybe refine that a little bit. So, like one of the interesting, like from the point of view of what it is as far as what phonological units we're looking at, our data actually shows something that someone would describe as like something internal to the segment, the movement of the formants inside an individual vowel, but at the same time it's also suprasegmental because it's the organization of the syllable structure, the consonant-vowel interaction at the same time. So we have like subsegmental and suprasegmental at the same time. And so if the L2 models are going to describe this, they probably need to have a refined view of what the segment is. And I actually just had a talk at McGill where I showed a little vision of that, but that was in McGill. So anyway, if you think about like just like the dress trap pair is like, this is a problem for Polish learners and for learners of many other L1 backgrounds as well. If you take a recording of me saying sat and you just play the first 30% of that vowel, it sounds like, and you cut out the rest, it sounds like I'm saying set. Because, okay, the articulation of, if I'm making a coronal consonant, my tongue body has to be raised a little bit when I'm doing it, and it takes a long time for me to get to that low target. And so the similarity then is based on what comes at the beginning of the vowel, between the dress trap, and later in the vowel there's more distinction. So in some sense this raises the question, okay, what portion of the vowel is important? So really we need to somehow show how these subsegmental and suprasegmental features may sort of converge to reveal something that's similar or not similar. So the difference between soon in native and Polish accented English is not the location of the individual segments in the word. There are minor differences, okay? The dental versus alveolar S is probably not such a something that people concentrate on. But what's different is the rate of change of the transition between them. So, and the sort of implication of that is that if we think of vowels as, we need to think of vowels, the vowel internal structure, what portion of that vowel houses what we might think of as its perceptual identity. So like, as a schematic, we might say, okay, this time window represents the duration of the vowel, and sort of Polish listeners base their percept on something relatively early in the vowel, and English speakers would base their percept on something relatively late in the vowel, meaning they have to hear how it moves to get here. And here here's our target. And then as the learners acquire proficiency, they learn to attend to later periods in the vowel. Okay, so, and going back to phonology, I just talked about phonology, but somehow our phonological description has to have a way of describing the transition from one segment to another. And so that's where I'll stop for now. I have another separate presentation with some of the details of a few of the experiments. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so questions, comments?
So start just to break the ice. Thank you very much for the very informative presentation, Jeff. I have a question. I have a few other questions I can ask you later, but you talked about the robustness for movement effects for when you have a vowel preceded by a coronal sound, right? And you kind of explained why articulatory phonology, right? But don't you think also the perceptibility of coronals also have to do with this? I mean, I thought that maybe because we know that coronals are less perceptible than labials and dorsals. So isn't that a way of for the speaker to be compensated for the lack of perceptibility and making those vowels, the duration of those vowels longer, or those movements longer?
Perhaps that's what happens in English. Yeah, perhaps it's. I mean, on the one hand, there seems to be a universal tendency for sort of coronal transitions to be less perceptible than labial or dorsal transitions. So, in order to deal with that, that probably has a lot of implications with regard to, okay, well, perhaps it's a compensation, the lengthening that we get, sort of the slower transitions in English. Perhaps that's a compensation for that. There are also I didn't talk about this, there are some sort of funny little wrinkles in the phonological system of Polish that, like with dorsals and front vowels, that sort of complicate the dorsal situation. The labial thing, I guess it is less robust. Yeah. So the source of that, sort of the phonological source of the effect in English is still open to interpretation. What's interesting is that, I mean, I would think that since the coronal context is so common across the board, coronals are the most common onsets, the most common place, and in some ways this could lead to a more generalization of the formant patterns that get induced. So we're not suggesting that only coronals have this effect, but it seems to be maybe we're getting a view onto the origin of the effect in a way, sort of from an evolutionary point of view, if you want to think about it that way. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. And that all serves as evidence for that idea that coronals are placeless, right? They don't have a place articulated, which I think is an interesting finding.
Yeah, well, I think that's also a language-specific thing, but I won't get into that. And yeah, other. Oh.
Jeff, really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for the talk. So just one quick comment. When you were talking about the importance of transitions, it reminded me there's a very good precedent in the child remediation therapy and sort of language disorder literature. There is a training paradigm that uses the slowing down and exaggeration of CVVC transitions for children with disorders. Okay. And apparently it's extremely useful, very helpful and efficient.
With VC as well.
Exactly. So basically slowing down or exaggerating the transitions.
Yeah.
For monolingual children, and there's been a couple of studies that applied it to second language phonological phonetic acquisition. Okay. So I can send you a couple of
that'd be interesting.
You have a really nice baseline in another kind of literature to use it to structure maybe some training studies.
I wonder about the VC aspect of it, because everything I showed you, we just kept T for all our codas. In some sense, coders were supposed to be less perceptually robust to begin with, but we also get this, we get the prefortis clipping effect in English, which could sort of clip the transitions. But on another level, in English codas, we often leave them unreleased, and in Polish, you have to release them. Presumably, if your language feels comfortable leaving coda stops unreleased, is because you're assuming that the listener can figure out which one it is anyway. So in that sense, you would expect more robust. Although we don't find much of a VC effect. I mean, we've looked at it a little bit, the CV effect. Of course, display. It's coming. Okay. So that's actually something that at the beginning of the project we were sort of planning on looking at, and then it didn't seem to be there was quite as much there in the formant movement approaching those codas.
I don't remember the exact details, whether it's CV or VC transitions, but the approach was that speech is too quick and transient for learners with difficulties to pick up on all of the detail. So you really have to extend it, exaggerate it, or slow it down so that they can hear all of the flavors. And it works for children with disorders, native speakers, and it works in a couple of studies for non-native speakers learning the second language. So I'll send you a couple of references.
Okay, great, thanks.
I just have a quick question. At the end of the talk, you seem to be asking the question of whether or not, for instruction purposes, it's worthwhile attending to a different part of the vowel, let's say for Polish speakers. And I'm wondering, do you think it's useful, based on the rest of the information before, do you have a reason for deciding that at a certain point in the vowel we should attend to this moment, as opposed to not having a specific point at all to attend to?
I would say not so much. I think this particular drawing is just, I put it in there because it's relatively simple. It's a simple enough visualization that we should be able to tell our teachers and our students to show them this, and they should be able to get it. I don't know if that is what I believe is like, if it's so simple as this, yeah? Because like a lot of the L1-VIS studies really pay more attention to the movement. So if I were to submit this paper to a phonetics journal, they would pick on this approach. They would say this is an oversimplification. It's really the trajectories that matter, and it's the whole time course of the vowels that matter. And they would disagree with the suggestion, okay, well, at one point in the vowel, but this effect is there. I mean, if I say sat and I play the first 30 milliseconds, 50 milliseconds, it sounds like eh. And my students hear it and they get it. Yeah, and that's so I guess the short answer to the question is this is probably an oversimplification, but I think it's a useful way of looking at it.
Thanks, I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
I know you kept saying that you think you seem we know these models. I totally don't. I don't do phonology at all. But this was super interesting. And when you said you don't like segments, that made so much sense. I've never heard anybody say that. That just makes so much sense. And I was wondering if you think that maybe segments are what constitutes a segment or whatever it would be very language specific.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was talking about at McGill. Is
tell us more.
Well, it's essentially you need a story. Your phonology needs a story for how two sounds in two different languages that happen to be transcribed with the same symbol differ in their phonetic realization and their phonological behavior.
Okay.
So part of the story that I was telling in McGill is that, well, in your representational system, you have to have the transition somehow encoded into your system. Yeah. So essentially, this CV transition, this is a portion of the acoustic signal. Yeah. Phonetically, it's like a vowel. It has formants. It's robust. Perceptually, acoustically, it's a vowel. Perceptually, it tells us something about the consonant. So each language's phonological system has to deal with this problem. They have to essentially choose. It's like a parameter, if you will. The language is going to say, okay, we're going to include this portion of the vowel as part of the representation of our consonants. Or they're going to include this portion of the vowel as part of the vowel. Yeah. So, but in a sense, you get, your SU sequence can be parsed in two different ways. Yeah. That's what I was talking about in McGill.
But there are languages that are so much more different from either Polish or English than those are from each other. Yeah.
I mean, there's all sorts of wrinkles you have to add into the system, right? But this ambiguity in saying, in trying to say, okay, how is it you can have things that are transcribed in the same symbol in different languages be so different? Yeah?
They're not the same.
Yeah, well, they're transcribed with the same symbol, but they have to be different in your phonological system. Any other questions? Anyone want to see any of the details of the experiment?
I just have a question. At the very beginning, you talked about the fact that where you work, there's a lot of emphasis placed on sort of fixing accents.
Mm-hmm.
And I had two questions related to that. I was wondering why the interest in fixing them, given that for a lot of L2 speakers, your accent is just part of who you are. But related to that is I was wondering of the phenomena that you described, especially the movement, what's the impact on comprehensibility?
On probably in the case of most everyday conversations is probably pretty minor.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, we are getting a little picky about phonetic details a little bit here. And what was the question about? Because in some cases the whole accent, and this gets a little political too, because it's like what's your pronunciation model, and this and that. So in a sense, okay, if we assume some sort of Southern British English model, then this seems to be an aspect of Southern British English if you want to sound native-like. Yeah? Of course, not whether one wants to sound native-like is a different question. It just so happens that our institution sort of tries to promote it.
And what is the reason for that?
That's a very interesting question. We had a very vocal debate about this at one of our conferences back, I don't know, it's been a while now. It's like 15 years ago. So there's a lot of resistance to some of the lingua franca stuff. Yeah, because we're philologists, we want to learn the language, and that's sort of the priority. And there was a sort of kind of a vocal debate about that for a while. I think I would say that our approach is more tolerant of variation than it used to be. So I mean, basically, okay, like when students come for their oral exam, maybe 25, 30% is their pronunciation, and people used to get marked off for silly things like sounding too Scottish.
No.
But I think we're much more tolerant to variation than we used to be. At least I hope so. I haven't actually been in on the practical oral exams in many years, so I don't have firsthand. I mean, it's all sort of through the grapevine. But I mean, some of our pronunciation teachers have been there for quite a while, and so actually one of the things you find there's like in British English, there's a definite generational shift in the trap vowel. It's moving back and lower.
Show us.
Sad. I don't know. I'm not an RP speaker or a Southern British speaker, or estuary speaker, or anything. But I mean, I just play around with British for fun, especially with like the lot and thought and all these. Just a few of these. Yeah, I pick and choose. I can't really speak British. But so there's a story. I know one of the PhD students who, younger, pays attention, watches all the recent stuff as far as like British TV is concerned, and she really had acquired this further back version of the trap vowel, and her pronunciation teacher in the first year used to give her a hard time about it. Oh, trap vowel is a little further than that. So there is some nitpicking. It is nitpicking, but it's one of the reasons they hired me, though, because for the acoustic, they originally hired me sort of to show acoustically what's going on. So I mean, I can't be too vocal in saying how much nitpicking it is. But I do like to fit it with the bigger picture of phonology and sort of the general system of English.
Just a question. Interesting talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering if in North America we have a French that has a pretty strong diphthongaison.
Yeah.
And as opposed to the European French, which is much more stable. I don't have the words to explain it, but would it be easier, for example, for a North American Anglophone speaker, which, especially from the South, maybe if there's a larger diphthongization, I think it is. Sorry. Would it be easier in terms of perception and production for a North American to go toward the North American version of French or the South American version of French, or the European version? Would that be something that your framework could predict?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I suppose I guess the source of the Canadian diphthongization is just older French, isn't it? Or is it sort of sort of interaction with English?
So they say it's old French.
It's
Do you know, Randall?
I think it's older. I think it was there before there was a lot of contact.
Yeah.
People don't have contact with it.
yeah, well, like in like Occitan and southern France, they've diphthongized. You cherchez le pain. Yeah. Le pain. Pain. That's what I've heard in the south of France. But in principle, yeah. I mean, the more you're exposed to the movement, probably the easier it is, or the more you're exposed to. My guess is going from a diphthongal system to a pure system shouldn't be too hard.
The reason I say that is because as a non-native French speaker, when I speak with a little bit of a diphthongation in French, it kind of feels like I'm putting some comfortable shoes on.
Okay. So do you accommodate that if you're in Europe? Will you speak?
Yeah, I have to
pure
tighten the laces a little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
So I can feel that there's a little bit more effort, when I just.
Yeah. Well, I mean. I don't know. I don't know what I would say about predictions of learnability when you're going the other way, right? From a dynamic system to a stable system. That's an interesting question. It's like, so. I suppose actually. Okay, one thing I do with my students sometimes is speak Polish with an American accent.
Yeah.
And I suppose I will incorporate a little more movement.
Show us what that sounds like.
Most of the time when I do that, I do it with like word frequency stuff and flapping and things like that, which like word boundary stuff and flapping. So dobre. There's this word dobre, yeah, dobre. Dzień dobry. Yeah, I don't know. I do it for fun. I haven't thought about it for the vowel, but I guess I do diphthongize a little bit more. I mean, I don't diphthongize quite the way British speakers, southern British speakers do. Of course, Scotland's a different can of worms.
Right.
That's true.
A big question. You said the larger your vowel inventory is, the more likely you are to diphthongize.
I don't know if I would make that a direct sort of claim. I would say that when you have a small vowel system, that's a sort of additional motivation. There are small vowel systems that have very diphthongal vowels too, like Russian. They only have like 5 or 6, but there's a lot of movement in Russian vowels that Polish doesn't have. I think it's also connected with stress timing and rhythm and things like that. And of course, things like Mandarin, there's all sorts of form of movement, and so it's. But not a very big. Well, I mean, yeah. Well, I guess in Mandarin you can claim various. Yeah, it's so I wouldn't necessarily say there's going to be a direct link. I think it's just sort of conducive to it. Yeah. And so I mean, if you think about Germanic, the generalization works because German has a fair amount of movement, not quite as much as English. Danish is just crazy. A lot of these Germanic languages have very sort of robust vowel systems, Scandinavian in particular. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.